Next, let's talk about workflows. Workflows allow us to specify how content moves through our system, from initial creation through to publishing, and even to archival, deletion, or any other final disposition. First, let's look at how we'll be interacting with workflows as a content contributor. Then, we'll take a look at how they're put together so we can better understand them. Let's go to some content. I'll go to my content, and let's choose blogs. We've already taken a look at blogs a few times now, so if I select one of them, we'll see something pretty familiar. Once I'm here in my blog properties, I can see on the right-hand side my workflow actions. They're represented by these three buttons. Below that, we can see a breakdown of our workflow. We see the content type, the workflow that the content type is using, the step that the content is currently in, and any assignee if relevant. So, workflows are based on content types. We'll see a different workflow for different content types if it's relevant. Some content types will simply use the system workflow, but others, like our blog here, will require a specific workflow so that the content is handled appropriately through its lifespan. So, our blogs have their own workflow. Again, the workflow determines how the content moves through its lifespan, using actions. And those actions are available to us here in these buttons. We can see lock for editing, reset workflow, and archive. The buttons that we see are of course determined by the workflow, as well as the current step that the content is in, as well as the state of that content. Steps and states are two different things, even though they sound very similar. When we're talking about states, what we're really discussing is how the content exists. As we can see, our African Safari blog is currently in the draft state. But below that, our 5 snow sports to try this winter is published. So this status icon will give us an indication of what state the content is currently in. But there's also steps. Clicking back on our African Safari, we'll see the step it's currently in is published. So even though it's in the published step, it's only in the draft state. That's important to understand. Content may be in a step that doesn't necessarily match the state that it's in. As in this case, even though we have published the content, so it's moved to the published step, it's currently waiting for the appropriate date to actually make this content live based on our posting date that we talked about before. The step determines what actions are available to us in the workflow and is exclusively part of the workflow. The state, however, provides context for how that content currently exists in dotCMS. So, again, states and steps are two different things, and it's important to understand that. Of course, as always, you can find more about this in our docs site. For now, let's focus on workflows. Again, looking at our actions, we can see a lock for editing button. Locking content ensures that we are the only ones who can make changes with it. So let's choose lock for editing, and you'll notice that now we have many more actions available to us. Once the content has been locked, that means that we can go ahead and make some changes. Now we can see that we can release the lock, save and publish, translate, or again, reset the workflow or archive. So again, workflow actions are dependent upon the context of the content. Is it locked? What state is it in? And what step is it in? All of these things, again, help us to ensure the content moves through its lifespan appropriately. So once we have made the changes we need to, we can choose where the content needs to go next or what needs to be done with it. Do we simply want to save the content? Do we want to release the lock and allow someone else to make changes? Do we want to translate the content to another language? Or do we want to reset the workflow entirely and start back from the beginning? We could even archive the content if it's no longer relevant. In this case, I'll click Save. Now again, it's still in the Publish step. Let's take a closer look at steps and how these work. I'll click the X, and I'll expand my global navigation. Let's go to Content Model and Workflows. Here we can see the workflows available on our site. The only two that we have are our system workflow, which is the default workflow, and the blogs workflow. We get a quick overview of the various steps within that workflow, and we can choose to click the pencil to edit the workflow properties, such as the name, description, and any content types that are currently assigned to that workflow. We can also copy these workflows or archive them. I'll click the X in the corner, and if we wanted to take a closer look, we could click View Steps. Here we can see the various steps for each workflow. This is likely something that you, as a content contributor, are not going to be able to see and modify. This is more so for your developers and administrators to set up for you. But again, it's helpful to understand how this works on the back end. We can see that we have 3 steps visible here, but if I scroll down, there's actually a 4th. The first 3 that we have are editing, QA, published, and the last one is archive. Now, the content is expected to move through these steps from left to right. And we have the actions from top to bottom. You'll notice we can have the same action in multiple steps. For instance, save. Of course, we want to be able to save the content in multiple places throughout the content's lifespan. When we're initially editing content, it will be here in the editing step until we choose an action that will move it on to the next step. We can see that if we choose Send for Review, it will actually send it to the QA step. We can see where each one of these actions sends the content to next. In the case of Save as Draft, it sends it here to editing, once again. But we also have the option for Send Email, which keeps it in the current step. We have Translate, which moves it off to Published, as well as Save and Save and Publish. You may be wondering why we have the option to Send for Review, which forces it through QA, and to Save, which would send it all the way to Published and skip the QA portion. Well, this is entirely dependent on who is currently looking at the content. Because not only is the workflow and the actions available dependent upon the state and the context of that content, it also depends on what the permissions are for the individual user. Certain users should be able to access and perform QA on the content, whereas other users should only be able to submit it for QA. Some users might be able to publish the content outright from the editing step. It entirely depends on that user's permissions. One way that we can easily see and get a glimpse at how this works is by using the Filter by Who Can Use dropdown. If I click the dropdown, I could choose any one of these individual users or roles and show only the actions that those users or roles would be able to use. Currently, this workflow has not been assigned to any individual users or roles, but there are other options as well. If I scroll to the bottom, I'll see anyone who can view, edit, publish, or edit permissions. These are obviously contextual options. Let's take a look at anyone who can view content. We'll see that, obviously, things are quite limited here. Anyone who can view content is usually reserved for our front-end users. So it's pretty unlikely that we would have many options here for this workflow. But let's look at anyone who can edit content. There we go. We see a few options, but they're still pretty limited. We see save as draft, send for review, and save published. Someone who can only edit the content, but can't publish the content or edit permissions of the content, should only be able to save as draft or send for review or save the content. Then, when the content moves to the QA step or published step, they can still save the content, but that's it. Now, the save action in this example is going to move the content to the publish step. So we probably want to modify that to make sure that it only takes it where it should be. Or we want to make sure that this user can't access this individual save action. But we could maybe have a different save action that does the same things, but doesn't move it to the published step, because we don't want to allow this user to publish content yet. We could also just modify this action and ensure that rather than moving this to the publish step, it keeps it on the current step. Then we can save it, and now we know this shouldn't move the content along. If we view this again by users who can edit, we can see it will keep it on the current step. This makes a little bit more sense. Now, what about this last step, archive/resolved? Now, archive is the step that it exists in. Resolved is merely a flag to let us know that once content has reached this step, it will be considered resolved. What that means is there's nothing more to be done with the content. Once it reaches the archive, we no longer need to edit or publish or review the content, and it is essentially retired. Of course, we could always take content out of the archive and start the whole process over again if we wish. But it's just to note that if content exists here, it is resolved, and by that, it will no longer appear as a task on anyone's dashboard. This is simply an example of how workflows work. And again, you as a content contributor will likely have no interaction with this specific page. You won't be able to modify and set up workflows yourselves unless you are a higher level user, such as a developer or administrator. But again, it is helpful to understand exactly how this works and why. As always, if you have any further questions or want to learn a little bit more about this, simply go to our doc site and search for workflows.